I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this important seminar. I see a lot of old friendly faces and new ones. I'm glad to share my experience and thoughts as a Muslim scholar with you. And in light of what Ambassador Gingrich said, I'd like to just point out one thing, that we Muslims, if we know our religion, then we are committed to religious freedom, which is why I signed these declarations, because the Quran asserts that there is no coercion in religion. And that's something we can also talk about. But almost 1,500 years ago, and I want to talk about women now, the Holy Quran succinctly stated in verse 49:13 that God created us from a male and a female and made us into different nations and tribes so that we get to know each other. In the Quranic context of this verse, it is clear that knowing each other means to communicate, to cooperate, and celebrate each other's differences. It does not mean to subordinate other cultures or to take a supremacist view of them. This message was fully understood by ancient Muslim jurists who belonged to a wide spectrum of nationalities, ethnicities, and cultures. This understanding had many ramifications. In the legal field, it meant that jurists encouraged various civilizations to incorporate their customs into law, so long as the customs did not violate Islamic principles and Quranic injunctions. Furthermore, jurist exegesis of Islamic texts also took into account local culture in developing their views about local social practices. Indeed, there was a dialectical relationship between Islamic jurisprudence and local culture throughout Islamic history. This dialectic relationship was rooted in the fact that the jurists themselves were the product of their culture. Thus, their own understanding of Islamic principles, even their understanding of verses and words in the Quran itself, were subconsciously colored by their cultural worldviews and presumptions. As a result, they often missed the fact that their implicit cultural assumptions and exegesis sometimes contradicted the very Islamic worldview that they belong to. This issue has acquired renewed urgency in light of the current state of the Muslim world. The global politics of the last century have resulted in a fragmented and weakened Muslim world, both geographically and culturally. Most significantly, due to colonialist policies as well as some local policies, Muslims were distracted and distanced from the Arabic language, which is the language of the Quran. Algeria is a prime example. This is incidentally true of both Arab and non-Arab countries. These policies seem to have been designed to ultimately distance Muslims from the Quran and subsequently from Islam itself. In other words, these policies were aimed at secularizing the Muslim world. Unfortunately, these policies have backfired to haunt not only the Muslim world, but the Western world as well. I'm speaking of recent developments as with the supporters of groups like ISIS. As recent events made amply clear, these policies resulted in generations of Muslims who have demonstrably superficial or erroneous understanding of Islam. Yet, angered by the continued plundering of Muslim lands by war, economic pressures, and direct interference in the sovereignty of Muslim countries, many Muslims decided to cling to their religion as their best hope for salvation. However, two problems complicated this approach. First, there is an established Islamic juristic rule which states that laws change with time and place. This rule does not refer to major Islamic principles, foundational ones, or Quranic injunctions, but to secondary laws. From the early days of Islam, Muslim jurists across the world accepted the need for ijtihad, which is engaging in jurisprudential activity. Ijtihad that suited the cultures, the times, the needs of the people. Unfortunately, however, many Muslim jurists were prevented throughout history from expressing their ijtihad freely due to the political systems in their countries. we're talking about authoritarianism. For example, instead of developing legal systems of governance based on the democratic principles articulated in the Quran itself and applied by Prophet Muhammad, rulers pressured jurists to develop ijtihad suitable to their political systems, which were mostly authoritarian. Those who dared to disagree suffered the consequences. This state of affairs has not changed significantly in our times, as you might tell from reading the newspapers. There are ample historic examples of this juristic rule, which was included in the Ottoman Majalla. For example, after the famous Grand Imam al-Shafi'i of 19th century moved to Egypt from Iraq, he decided to revise his school of thought that he had established in Iraq. He did so because he realized that Egyptian culture and customs differed significantly from those of the Iraqis. Without revisions of his earlier jurisprudence to suit the new culture, that earlier jurisprudence could have adverse effects on the Egyptian society. Second, with the weakening of the Arabic language and the tradition of ijtihad in the Muslim world, primarily in the Sunni countries, Muslim populations became less capable of distinguishing between Islamically based laws and social practices versus ones that are purely cultural and have nothing to do with the religion. The blurring of this distinction confused the average person. So most people ended up regarding the whole body of laws and major social practices as religiously inspired, and hence sacrosanct. Any attempt by Western-oriented parties to critique these laws was viewed as with suspicion and vehemently resisted. A major example of this state of affairs is that of female circumcision, better known in the West as FMG, and in Islamic culture as khifad, a practice which is known only in some Muslim countries, and yet it is regarded erroneously as a required Muslim practice. As I will discuss later, the practice does not have a solid jurisprudential foundation either in the Quran or in the Hadith, which is the words of the Prophet. This fact may surprise many, including Muslims, but members of the audience can examine this fact on their own by referring to our paper, which is entitled Debunking the Myth that Islam Requires Female Circumcision. You can go to our website, karamah.org. Karamah is spelled Karamah.org, and look for the piece on FMG. Let me briefly describe our research in that paper, in which Ms. Ghazal and Ms. Asaf were junior authors. It is based on the following facts. In April of 2017, federal charges were brought in the US by the FBI in the state of Michigan, accusing a woman Muslim doctor, of performing female genital mutilation, an act prohibited by American law. The charges were brought against Dr. Jumana Nakaragwala, alleging that she had performed FGM on two 7-year-old girls at a medical clinic in Detroit. Dr. Nagarwala is the first Muslim doctor to face federal FGM prosecution in the United States. The criminal complaint against her states that members of her community are known to practice FGM on young girls as part of their religious and cultural practice. The practice itself is concentrated geographically on the African continent, and historians place the origins of these practices within two non-Muslim locales, Pharaohic Egypt and ancient Ethiopia. In the case of Egypt, the practice of female circumcision was attributed to the aristocracy of the time. There is evidence, however, to support the view that all segments of society held this practice. The Islamic scholar Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani of the 15th century mentions in his book Fath al-Bari that this practice came to the Arabian Peninsula from its origins in Egypt through Nile River migration. There is no explicit statement in the Quran or Hadith that establishes khifad as mandatory. Nevertheless, the proponents of the view that female khifad is religiously mandated support their position by citing certain Quranic verses and hadiths. In our white paper, Debunking the Myth, we go through all these arguments one by one to show their invalidity. For example, the Quranic citation, which says, follow what Abraham has done, turns out to be unwarranted because it actually does not establish khifad. You can follow Abraham by believing in one God. Our detailed treatment of hadiths as to their matan or content, as well as to their isnad, which is the chain of narration, how it came down to us, shows that the sunnah of the Prophet actually discouraged this practice. But such conclusions are hard to reach except by jurists who are deeply familiar with the language of the Quran and the proper analysis of the hadith. When we revealed our study to Muslim women and community at large, our audience was stunned and pleased. Some who were victims of female circumcision had tears in their eyes. Extra-religious arguments offered in favor of this practice are enlightening. Major among them is the argument that female circumcision preserves the woman's chastity. Looking at it from a womanist perspective, this practice is clearly designed to diminish forever the woman's ability to enjoy her sexuality, even after marriage. Thus, female circumcision can be viewed as a tool to control women's desires. Indeed, men in some countries refuse to marry women who have not been circumcised. The fear of a robust female sexuality is clearly a patriarchal one that has permeated all cultures for millennia. Islam rejects this fear and celebrates women's capabilities, including their sexuality, as made amply clear by the prophetic hadiths. Significantly, women in the house of the Prophet were not themselves circumcised. The only major limit Islam places on sexuality is that it be confined to marital relationships, and that limit applies to both male and female. In my book, The Islamic Worldview, I studied verse 434 of the Quran. Many women had come to me asking about it and its apparent subordination of women to men. I understood their concerns. I also grew up hearing that the verse states that men are superior to women. It took me 2 advanced academic degrees before I could muster the courage to tackle this issue. In the end, the solution was staring me in the face. The Quranic words did not have the meaning assigned to them by the jurist. The assigned meanings were the product of an authoritarian culture and patriarchal fancy, not divine decree. Indeed, properly understood, the verse was a limitation on men's interference in women's lives. Instead, it became a club used to subjugate them. For more on this matter, you can also check my article on the website entitled Islam, Law and Custom, the Karamah website. In the next few minutes, I would like to share with you 2 more myths about Islam that are in reality the result of patriarchal ijtihad, i.e. the result of patriarchal culture infecting religious thinking. While there have been outstanding insights by some Muslim jurists about women's issues, it was hard for them to do so consistently when the world was awash with universal patriarchal thinking around them. That thinking remains with us in modified forms till this day, in the US and Europe, as well as in the rest of the globe. But now we are more aware of it. It is no longer invisible. While it may vary in its expression from one culture to another, it's nevertheless universal in its scope. Patriarchal thinking rooted in power and not in justice is inimical to Islam. It is perhaps the most damaging aspect of cultures that have invaded juristic exegesis. This is especially true since the core of all Islamic principles is that of adala, or compassionate restorative justice. In our forthcoming third white paper, debunking the myth about the patriarchal nature of paradise, which sounds like an esoteric topic, it isn't. Ms. Ghazal and I address the claim that martyrs are rewarded 72 virgins. Where did you hear about that? Okay, in paradise. More generally, another form of this claim asserts that men that go to heaven will be rewarded with ethereal virgins that have large, lustrous eyes. This claim has upset many Muslim women, you can imagine, who wondered what do they get in heaven, and of course has also helped many men decide to go to heaven faster than their normal course of life. Unfortunately, this claim has been used to recruit gullible Muslim men to participate in armed conflicts scattered all over the Middle East. In fact, the Quran does not mention virgins. It speaks about al-hur. These are paradisiacal entities about which we are told very little in the Quran. Yet this term has been interpreted by most male jurists as referring to these virginal maidens. In reaching this interpretation, jurists were influenced by their patriarchal fancy, deeply rooted in their patriarchal cultures. This cultural bias has led them to ignore an important grammatical fact of the term hur'ain, in that it does not have a feminine gender. It is either gender inclusive or gender neutral. However, once jurists assigned a female gender to these entities, they tended to interpret them as a Quranic reference to pairing these entities with humans as reference to marriage. So now we have marrying these maidens. Subsequently, the myth of the 72 virgins took a life of its own in popular culture. We will be releasing this study soon. Our third example comes from our white paper entitled Debunking the Myth That Angels Curse the Woman Who Rejects Her Husband's Sexual Demands. From the Philippines, where we gave a 3-week session on these issues, thanks to the American Embassy and Miriam College. We were asked by concerned women whether it is true that if a woman refuses her husband's request to come to the marital bed, she will be cursed by angels till the morning. The hadith was being used by husbands to make women feel guilty about refusing to engage in sexual activity after a long day of hard work and child care. Our analysis of this hadith again shows that the role patriarchal culture has played in its interpretation of Islamic religious texts is great. The correct import of the hadith was not one of pressuring women to become subservient to their husbands' whims. Rather, it was about spouses being kind to each other and not engaging in sexual power games. Again, jurists with patriarchal bias missed this fact. Of course, I can go on and provide additional examples, but I know we have a time limit. Indeed, there are numerous examples of patriarchal cultural influences that have seeped into the worldviews and psyches of jurists, politicians, parents, and even the average citizen, male and female, in various patriarchal societies around the world, Muslim and non-Muslim. This presentation focuses only on Islamic cultures, but reversing the entrenched and pervasive influence of patriarchy in Islam and other religions requires a great deal of hard work, coupled with deep faith, thoughtful insights, and a systematic womanist critique of the accumulated work of religious scholars. I would like now to make a few recommendations that would help Muslims in the West lay the foundation to become equal partners in juristic exegesis with other Muslims, and to help them bring their unique Western Muslim point of view to the Muslim world. As you know from my various discussions, understanding the grammar, the language, etc., the Arabic language of the Quran was critical. So it is important to include in the education of Muslim children the study of Arabic, the language of the Quran, so that they would have a direct relationship and not interpretation by somebody else who has a different agenda. Incidentally, France has already proposed such an approach. This can be done through public or private efforts, but it should not be made beyond the reach of the poor, who need it most of all, since they are often the target of quasi-religious manipulation. This education will arm these children against misrepresentation or misinterpretation of their religion, and it would also help protect them against false and manipulative claims about their religion. I suggest providing these children with the same education also received by the children of the major culture in society or the dominant culture, and have them share classrooms. I don't believe in segregating these groups. This approach would help them build friendships, bridges, and teach them how to interact with other kids that are culturally different. Ultimately, this experience will reduce any feeling of cultural isolation these children may have and open them to new experiences. Furthermore, if any of them grow to be jurists, they can utilize their social experience to apply intelligently the rule that laws change with time and place in their community. They would also be sufficiently knowledgeable to make valuable contributions to the jurisprudence of their own country. 3. Patriarchy is a serious disease. that afflicts at least half the world population and sickens the other half. Let us raise children who are immune to it. The best immunization is education. Islamic gender equitable education would be a great step in this regard, and it will encourage Western Muslim women to take leadership roles in their societies, as is already happening in the United States. This education, however, must be led by credible Muslim women and not by women from outside the community, except as guest speakers. And at this point, I want to recognize that recently 2 Muslim women have been elected to the US Congress, and I congratulate them. Support other cultures as a fourth element that are addressing internally their own challenges, especially in the area of religion, without trying to lead or interfere with that process. In our experience, such attempts to interfere from the outside in other cultures poisons the well for accepting true new ijtihad. Memories of the Crusades and later attempts at hegemony by various countries in Europe have not faded yet in many Muslim countries. Further, the recent mass rejection of immigrants from war-torn countries signaled a lack of true humanitarian concern. So it's very important that the change would happen from the inside of the community. 5, teach about successful models of intercultural cooperation instead of focusing on clash of civilizations. An understudied example of such cooperation comes from Sicily, here in Italy. According to Professor John Makdisi, I quote, "The Muslims who ruled Sicily for over 200 years before the arrival of the Normans were enlightened rulers who had made the island the culture of an Arab civilization as splendid as that of Cordova itself. Fortunately, the advent of the Romans did not destroy this culture. With a genius for adaptation, the Normans integrated it with their own. The Muslims continued to practice their religion freely and to be governed by their own judges and laws. This characteristic differentiated Sicily from Spain." End of quote. As we know, Spain's policy is known for its inquisition, fairly or unfairly, and the exclusion of Muslims and Jews. This policy adversely affected Spain in the long run. But in Sicily, the result of the Norman policies was nothing less than spectacular. According to Charles Norman Haskins, and I quote, "Nowhere else did Latin, Greek, and Arabic civilizations live side by side in peace and toleration, and nowhere else was the spirit of the Renaissance more clearly expressed in the policy of the rulers. Today, we can aspire to improve on the Sicilian model by executing it on a global scale, basing it on established principles of mutual respect and cooperation, and not on domination, interference, or subjugation." So as a Muslim, I believe these recommendations are all desirable and achievable. After all, the Quran enjoins us to spread peace and goodwill on this earth. And thank you.